Hi, I'm Alexandra, and I'm a bibliophile. Welcome to a lovely jaunt where we talk about literature. Today I'm going to be talking about Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. And as you can see, this is a fairly thick novel, fairly chunky. It was a lot of fun to get through, and I really enjoyed it. I've read a couple of other novels by Elizabeth Gaskell, or attempted. Mary Barton I read and really enjoyed. I attempted North and South, but found it not readable. The main character was a little bit maudlin for me, so I just wasn't into it. And it could be one of those things where I wasn't in the right mood to enjoy the book or the characters. But for what it's worth, this one was great. Mary Barton I loved, North and South not so much. Okay, so some historical context. This book was written during Victorian England by an author who lived during Victorian England, so it's contemporaneous with pretty much Elizabeth Gaskell's life. She's setting it a few years behind when she's actually writing it, but it's more or less considered a contemporaneous novel. Now, Victorian England is basically, that era is comprised of when Queen Victoria was reigning, and her reign lasted from 1837 to 1901, and so more or less that's the period that we're considering in England. And Gaskell is a Victorian author because her works are published, and she lived right smack dab in the middle of this period. Some of the aspects of this era I think we're really familiar with, but at the same time the way we view Victorian England now, with like a lot of sort of haunted houses and seances and being scary and creepy, is definitely not how they would have seen themselves at that time. So yes, there's an increase in religion and spirituality, which is where a lot of that comes from. There's an increase in trying to commune with the dead and experimenting with that sort of thing, with sort of non-standard spiritual connections, and by non-standard I mean basically outside of Christianity. But at the same time, it's really important to recognize that this period is also a great increase in science. Darwin has published The Origin of the Species at this time. So there's an increased interest in science and naturalism, the biological sciences, the scientific method in general, discovery, technology. We have, trains are becoming more and more widespread, industrialization, all of that as well. So they would have thought of themselves as very much a modern time, a technologically advancing time, a scientifically advancing time. Increased interest, really big time in archaeology as well. So kind of all of those things at a time of discovery, exploration, scientific inquiry are also increasing at this time. Loosely, we have what's referred to as the Pax Britannica from 1815 to 1914. So this is in a time of relative peace, right after the second round of Napoleonic Wars between England and France. And we also have an expanding variety in Christian churches. So you don't merely have the Catholic Church and the Church of England for your main staples of faith, right? So we had that split with Henry VIII. Now we have the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. So you can think of it as something more similar to what we have now, where there's a variety of different Protestant churches as well that are flourishing. Now to talk a little bit about the social novel and what that means, and how this fits into that category. So publication of novels really surged during this time as well. Genres such as the Gothic novel, so again, think of like your creepy stories. Jane Austen is kind of parodying it in her work, Northanger Abbey. And then we have a little bit of the Gothic in Jane Eyre and some of the Bronte sisters as well. The Castle of Otranto is a classic example. And then we also have the social novel being developed, which is the genre that this really falls under. And Gaskell wrote, to my knowledge, exclusively social novels. Social novels basically reflected the culture's need to deal with the social upheaval that came with industrialization, a return to a religion, developments in science and political changes at the period. So we have an increase in the suffrage movement for women to vote and have political power. All of those things are happening during this time. So the social novel serves a very important purpose for society to deal with all of these changes, reflect on them, understand them, and deal with them within the realm of fiction. Naturalism is a really popular hobby at this time. And then, as mentioned, Darwin is studying and publishing during this time, and that has huge cultural impact. It cannot be overstated how much it's really affecting the social atmosphere at the time. Now, as to Gaskell herself, some biographical information. Gaskell was well educated and married fairly young. She studied her children through her diary. She was really interested in noting the relationship that her daughters had to each other, and she even reflected upon her own relationship as a mother. And a lot of that will come through in a novel like this that meditates on the life of a family. Mary Barton was her first really popular book. It was extremely successful. And later, her works were pretty severely criticized, but if you could take a look at what they're criticizing about her, it's really more a reflection of the sexism of the time than any real fault in her works. And Gaskell, especially since the 1970s, has had a real resurgence in the popularity of analysis and literary criticism, coming back into the canon and being an author that we talk about a lot more. More recent criticism really reveals the sophistication with which Gaskell investigated complex social issues. So, and just as a side note, I'm thinking about creating some annotated bibliographies on articles that are easily found through Google Scholar. So let me know if that's a resource or something that you would be interested in. Another thing that's really interesting about Elizabeth Gaskell is she's the daughter of a Unitarian minister, and then she also married a Unitarian minister. And I think this is reflected in her books that while they're moral, they're interested in what's wrong and what's right and doing the good thing and not doing the bad thing. They're interested in rewarding the good characters. It's not necessarily Christian in its theological approach. There's not a real theological approach at all, or a sense of a higher power, a God who's sort of dictating what this goodness and badness is. There's just sort of a meditation about what's the proper way to move through life and to be a moral person. So first of all, I'm going to rate it based on the question of whether or not it's good. Is it of literary value? And I gave this 3.5 stars. You can see that on my Goodreads. I'm a lovely Jaunt there as well, so if you want to follow me, you can follow me on a lovely Jaunt at Goodreads. And I do want to clarify, because I feel like I give out stars differently than other people. I feel like most people say that 3 is average, and then 2 or below is some kind of badness, and then 4 and 5 are actually good books. For me, 0 is bad, 1 is where good starts, and then it just gets better from there. So that means that I've only really given a handful of 5 stars, maybe 2 or 3 in all of the books that I've read, because I find that very few books are that excellent in terms of literary value. Second rating was, did I like it? Did I find it entertaining? And this even more so. I gave this 4 stars. This is basically a marriage plot book, so we're watching the main character and trying to figure out, and follow the events. Will she end up with the man that we know she deserves to be with? But despite its length, I read it quickly. It only took me a few days to get through, and I really enjoyed the process. I really enjoyed following the characters and finding out what happened next. So this book is set in 1830s England. Our main character is Molly Gibson. She's a good girl. We know that she's a good girl. She's not particularly worldly or sophisticated, but she is honest and sincere and earnest and loves people very deeply. In the story, her mother has died when she was very young, and so as she gets older, her father realizes that he needs to remarry. And as a result, she gets a little bit of an annoying stepmother and a beautiful and charming stepsister, and they have a really neat relationship. And this beautiful and charming stepsister captures the heart of the man that Molly doesn't even realize that she really is in love with. And so the question is, will they end up together? And pretty much yes. We know that will happen, much like sports movies, much like any other marriage plot. We know that the characters who are destined to be together do end up together. But what's interesting about this book is that it's not actually finished. Yes, she had more to write. This book was serialized in Cornhill magazine from 1863 or 1864 to 1866, but Elizabeth Gaskell died in 1866 before finishing it. She probably only has like a chapter left, which is like the two main characters getting married. We pretty much know that they're destined to be together, and we have the book moving in that direction already. So we pretty much know that they end up together. Even though this book is a marriage plot, it is much more character-driven than it is plot-driven. And as a result of that, I'm going to take my analysis and start with juxtaposing pairs of characters, because the book is set up with several that do well in contrast with one another, and they speak volumes by their differences. But in the process of that, some concepts that I want to kind of cover are manners, polite society, and how that affects the way that characters interact with each other, how that affects the action of the novel, and really how different that kind of society is from our own. Power and autonomy is another concept that I want to cover as well. We have characters who are lords and ladies, landed gentry, they have money, they have power in this society, and we have characters with decreasing levels of power from there, and decreasing places in the social hierarchy. Also, the marriage market. So it is a marriage novel, so we're obviously talking about the marriage market. Basically, how do we transact money, social status, good character, and other kind of more nuanced benefits that come from marrying the right person. And what does that mean? The society of the family. Despite the fact that this is a marriage plot, the great bulk of this work meditates upon the relationships that are not between the lovers, but between the children and the parents and brothers and sisters. We get a very intimate look at a couple of different families in this neighborhood, and we get to see what does that society of the family look like? How does it function? And it's really interesting. And then finally, in particular, an analysis of the child-parent relationship. That is the most important. Relationships are the most, not the most important relationships, but the relationships that this book spends the most amount of time meditating on and presenting. So we have the relationship between Molly and her father, between Cynthia and her mother, between the sisters, and also in a couple of other families, which we'll get into. You can find me on all social media platforms pretty much at a lovely Jaunt. We can continue the conversation there or in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you thought of the novel if you've read it. And if there are concepts that I skipped over or missed that you found particularly interesting, let's keep the conversation going. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Until next time, I'm Alexandra, and I'm still a bibliophile.